Welcome to episode 4, the first annual holiday episode of the Change My View podcast, the official podcast of the 250,000 strong Reddit Change My View community. This podcast is the work of the Reddit Change My View moderation team. In the spirit of the season, we've decided to focus on what book we would gift. Interpret that question as you will. And we'll touch on the ethics of what we tell children about Santa. Not the Santa's helpers at the mall now, but about the real Santa. Decking our halls this episode are Reddit user BostonDrivingIsWorse and 3 CMV moderators, Blackheart and PepperoniFire, both returning for the second episode, and me, Hatch, or Michael Hatch IRL, as your ho-ho host. We got stuck in a chimney for a good part of the second half, so the audio's a bit different, but the discussion comes through clear as a jingle bell. So whether your stockings are full of deltas or lumps of coal for all those Rule 2s, we wish you a happy holiday from all of us at Change My View. I am Michael Hatch, joined here today with Blackheart, PepperoniFire, and another guest here has been our audio engineer expert who's been helping us out. And I'll let him introduce himself a little bit later, but he's been helping a ton with the program and working with us lay people to make it sound pretty, because that's his deal. So our question for today was originally started, I think, Pepperoni, I think it was your idea to start with, right? And don't worry, I'll go first here, like we talked, but just wanted to give you credit on that. And basically, in the spirit of the holiday season and gifting, we're going to talk about what book would you gift? And so leaving that a little open-ended, because that immediately comes with a little bit of baggage of, well, what do you mean, right? Or what kind of book or for who? I'm just going to dive in and give my answer, and then we're going to each kind of take our own interpretation on the question and try and keep things related to the Change My View topic, as that's what we're doing. So the book that I'm going to recommend is called Made to Stick. And so I'm going to grab it. It's right next to me here. Made to Stick is written by Chip Heath and Dan Heath, one of the favorite books I've ever read. And the concept is, why do some ideas live and others fail, right? So, how to give someone CPR didn't quite go as viral as, say, an urban legend about an axe murderer in the backseat, right? That's sort of one of their examples. And so what they identify are 6 components to basically what makes certain ideas work on human beings. Which ideas survive in the environment of human ideas better than others. So it's a quick breakdown of the topic is it's an acronym of success: a simple, unexpected, clear, concrete, emotional, and based on a story. And it's just I find that it's not just good for marketing or organizing a plot or a campaign or screenplay, but it's also good in kind of organizing sometimes long-term projects. You're like, what the hell is this thing I'm doing, and why is it important? And so it's about organizing the idea, making it clear, and how to make it actually make sense and relevant to the world around us and other people. So highly recommend it, not just for advertising, but sort of in a way organizing one's own thoughts. I think it's pretty useful, and at least for me, an area which I had a lot of growing room to do in, and it helped me a lot. So that is Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath of Stanford, and highly recommend and would gift to anyone. But yeah. Okay, now I want to read that book.
Are we doing the discussions right after each person, or are we just going around the table first?
I think around, and then we circle back after everyone said something and can kind of do a round table.
Who's ready to order next?
I guess I'm raising my hand because no one else is.
All right, cool.
I'm going to say How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie, particularly for people on Change My View. And this is why I thought you were going to steal my book idea.
I was literally thinking of it. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah. But it's a really nice, it was written, the 30s, 40s?
And by the way, this is Blackheart speaking now.
Yeah.
Just for the audience.
But it's a really good, timeless book about sort of how people really feel and how they think and how to really get people emotionally involved in things, how to change their mind on things, how to influence people by sort of exploiting their self-interests almost. I mean, that makes it sound worse than it is, but it's a really good, interesting read for how to sort of understand people's motivations and how to work with them.
Right on. All right, cool. Good summary. Nice and pithy. Who else would like to go next? We have
I can go. So I'll preface this by saying it's not something I would give to everybody. But one reason why I'm choosing this book, which I will tell you in a minute, is because I've found that there's a problem in CMV of people talking past each other unintentionally because we don't define what we don't define the words we're working with, and you're often working with two people who have two different definitions. So I really like A Brief History of Liberty. I know it's somewhat American-centric, but I know CMV also tends to be a little American-centric, and conversations that we have often relate back to Western democracies, freedom, liberty, and where we draw the lines on these things. So the reason why I like this book is it takes a pretty, broad topic of liberty and brings it down into more concrete confines, the way it's been defined by various philosophers throughout time, how it's been used historically and in several forms of government. And it uses a lot of social scientific analysis, which is hit or miss with me sometimes, but it basically takes this and breaks it down with a lot of clarity, a lot of well-defined parameters, and I think it does a good job of also demonstrating a good way to write about a complex and multifaceted philosophical principle. And, CMV is all about ideas, but one benefit I found is it's gotten me better at communicating with a broad swath of audiences and being able to take those complex or sophisticated stuff that maybe not everyone has been exposed to and turn it into something easily digested by whatever audience I'm working with at the time.
Right on. And Pepperoni, would you mind saying the title of that book one more time, please?
A Brief History of Liberty by David Schmitz and Jason Brennan.
A Brief History of Liberty. Great. Thank you, PepperoniFire. And now, finally, our first time joining us, our volunteer audio engineer who's done a ton to really help us out in a huge way, put in some hours with me trying to work this stuff out. Welcome to the podcast, user BostonDrivingIsWorse.
Yeah, so this is a question. When you asked me to be a part of this, first off, I was like, holy crap, I'm punching way above my weight here. Like, man, I've edited interviews with both PepperoniFire and Blackheart, and you guys are both way more articulate than I ever hoped to be. But in any case, this is a question that I actually struggled with. Who am I gifting this to? What is the intention of the gift? Those sorts of questions. And I came up with a couple, and I sort of went back and forth. The first book that I came up with was a really conservative sort of like feel-good, heartwarming book, Tuesdays with Maury, which is like the typical young man learns from old man sort of story. And I was like, well, that's lame. That's stupid. That can't be my book. Like, that's kindling for a book fire if I ever gave that to somebody. And then I was like, I went totally in the other direction. And I was like, all right, well, what about 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene? That's sure to stir some controversy, which is basically just a total pragmatic look at every human interaction that you could ever possibly hope to have, with historical examples included. And ultimately, I thought, what really exemplifies something in an idealistic way that I would love to gift somebody. And the book that I came up with was actually Jonathan Livingston Seagull. I don't know if you guys have read it before. It's much less science-y or much less analytical than any of the books that you guys mentioned. But it's really a simple story about following and perfecting your nature in the most idealistic way possible. As Mihatch mentioned, I'm an audio engineer, and so my job, working with music and in a creative medium, fundamentally relies on having an idealistic vision. And as simple as it sounds to come up with, find something that you love and are really good at and figure out a way to perfect it. As simple as that sounds, it's actually something that I think everybody could internalize more and follow more. So it's not a difficult read. It's a very short read, but I think it has a powerful but difficult to put into practice message. So that's my book, Jonathan Livingston Seagull.
Right on. Cool, man. All right, so just to recap, I'll just list out real quick here. I proposed Made to Stick, the Stanford brothers who wrote about ideas working on people. Then we have How to Make Friends and Influence People, the longtime gigantic classic from Blackheart. and Brief History of Liberty from PepperoniFire. And finally, from Boston, we have, after thinking about Tuesdays with Morrie or 48 Laws of Power, we landed on final answer of Jonathan Livingston Seagull. So, all right, there we go. I'll do a quick recap here, and this will help for our listeners too, is that the book is built around an acronym. And the word off of the word success, which is simple, unexpected, clear, concrete, emotional, and based on a story, which are the 6 elements that if you want an idea to spread or go viral or stick in people's minds, the more of those you have, the better.
I think that's a really a good way to sort of think about how to explain things in CMV and in general, because people sort of zone out. You hear, like, you want to show them a big, like, science talk, and they'll just zone out entirely. Or political pundit, they'll just zone out entirely. But if you give them somebody like John Oliver, they'll be really interested. So I think entertainment has a big, important value in sort of taking really complicated topics and distilling them in a way that keeps people engaged and makes them want to remember and want to be engaged with the information that's being presented. Which is why things like even like nature documentaries, they don't just talk about the animals, they give the animals names and personalities and story arcs and things like that to really try to draw you in.
Yeah, it reminds me of, we had an old saying, one of the people I've worked with over the time, my old business partner, he and I had this saying, it's 100 IQ, not jaded. And so we were basically talking about, when we're working out here trying to create content in Hollywood, you're in a bit of an echo chamber, leaning liberal, and with a lot of people who have done so much creative work that they know how the clockwork works, the magic's a little bit gone, they know the techniques, the magic tricks, And so it's like, if you're thinking of your audience, a good way to reset is to say, you know what? You want to aim at the person that's 100 IQ, not jaded. Someone who's literally the definition of just the middle of the road target audience. So it just made me think of that when you were just saying that. But it is a good read because they apply their own principles to the book itself, which actually makes it pretty compelling when you're reading it. So it's sort of it loops back in on itself. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing sounds a lot like this exercise I had to do in school. My one all year, and they made us like go through Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech and mark each sentence of whether it was pathos, ethos, or logos. Like the
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I think
that's really cool.
Yeah, I think like just about every school makes you do this, but it sounds like your book is sort of gunning for the same idea, but maybe breaking it down in a way that's, I don't want to say easily understood, because really like the concept isn't hard to understand to begin with, but maybe more palatable to a modern audience. Pathos, egos, logos sounds really stuck up and whatever. And I guess I'm curious to hear, like, in using this in your life, I assume you've tried to apply it. Like, do you find that you confirm their thesis, or are there things you'd correct about it? What are your takeaways?
I find that it's sort of, I think when I was younger, I was much more linear, and I wanted the world to be, I was a little bit more Vulcan, I guess. And it took some time in my 20s trying to be a writer and tapping into Carl Jung and Joe Campbell and sort of getting into that to sort of get more into the humanness of being on this planet, I guess. And so this book sort of fell into that time of development for me, it was probably 10 years ago, where I thought, okay, it kind of did a nice job of like both being based on a scientific basis, but also admitting the fact, hey, you're not trying to sell ideas to computers. You're selling ideas to human beings. And so in that sense, it worked well on me because of, I guess my answer to the question, do you think it worked? I'd say it worked on me because they use their own principles in their own book.
Do you think it worked on you because, did you pick the book because you thought, I guess it's a chicken or an egg question, like, do you think it worked on you after you read the book, or you picked the book because it appealed to things that are already part of your strengths?
I picked the book because I had just recently finished Steven Pinker's, I think it was The Blank Slate. That or How the Mind Works, one of those two. And then Amazon recommended it as the most common buy.
I had a really great articulate thought, and then I forgot it.
It's the story of my life.
Yeah, exactly.
Life is just one big, great articulate thought.
I think it's an interesting concept. That's right. Blackheart, I think it was you who mentioned John Oliver.
Yeah.
And in terms of making news entertaining. And I know it's like just beyond beating a dead horse at this point to sort of take it back to the election, but it is still fairly new in that really I think a large part of this election was predicated on appealing to emotion. And I think regardless of what side of the fence you're on, both sides would agree that that was a factor this time. And it came out, and it's sort of been certainly passed around Reddit and in both political spheres of, and it was on John Oliver, actually, the clip of Newt Gingrich arguing that his feelings were just as good as other people's facts. And I think that that's sort of the other side of making information interesting, but beyond the point of making it interesting to the point where it's actually influencing people in a negative way to take their feelings as a legitimate source, essentially.
Right.
Well, it's the truthiness of a statement. It's how much people can feel like it's relatable and feel like it's true, even if it's not based in any objective, statistical data or anything like that. It's how much people feel that it's true.
Exactly.
Or sort of like the distinction between news and news entertainment.
Yes.
Yeah, I still think the silver bullet here, though, is like, how much time do we waste checking facts? Like, if we had an authoritative, like, credit bureau of some kind that could just give a number score to facts on my Facebook and highlight it, like, because that only has to be done one time and then distributed. And then everyone could just, like, say, because if each person fact checks everything on their own all the time, it's happening like billions of more times than it needs to. It only happens once. It just needs to be distributed. Like, once that's been checked, right? I mean, do you think that's feasible?
Well, isn't that just PolitiFact?
Yeah, pretty much. That's exactly what I was going to say, is PolitiFact. Not only that, but I think that, and I can hear the CMV bells ringing in my head of, like, I can already see, like, comment number one is somebody saying, okay, well, who decides what, like, facts or what the rating scale is going to be?
Well, I think that's the difference between having a sort of bureaucratic authority versus a private entity. How, like, you don't enforce these things, but you try to make sure that it's public knowledge, try to educate people.
Like an entity that would build trust, like TransUnion, Experian,
Yeah.
Well, I mean, to stick with Mihatch's book, the title is Why Ideas Stick, not Why Correct Ideas Stick. So there might be a distinction between...
Great point.
An idea that sticks, that's filled with errors but has mass appeal, versus ideas that are right, but they're not quote unquote marketed in a good way, so they fall to the wayside.
Well, that was something I had we went out for, like, I'd say dinner, but it was like 3 a.m. We went out to just a little dine-in place, had some pancakes and stuff. But the waiter we were talking with him a little bit, and he was saying about Trump and everything. He was clearly trying to beat around the bush, but he was a Trump supporter. But he was saying something interesting about how he's felt that he was honest, which we finally kind of got it out of him, that it wasn't so much that he was telling the truth, it's that he was one of the good old boys. It's sort of that trustworthiness, that he's honest with himself, that he's, like, open, not politically correct. And I think that had a lot more influence than any, objective facts.
And it worked. Whatever that was, that whole project, man, it worked.
I mean, it's funny that you bring up political correctness, because that was sort of what I was thinking. That was one of the words I was thinking of when I picked my book. The book's entire idea is to try and give contours to this really broad idea. And during this election, not to just keep talking about the election, but it's relevant. It's like a lot of people were talking about, like, political correctness, and a lot of the podcasts I've been listening to have been trying to discuss whether or not that's valid. And it's funny because all of these people who work for, the New York Times and Slate, the Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal, I couldn't get from any of them, like, any definition of what they meant by political correctness. And it's funny to see how through their conversations you could get an idea of what they were trying to talk about. And in that way, it was like, oh, no wonder anyone can have a reasonable conversation about it. Like, the Wall Street Journal sees political correctness as A, and Slate sees it as B, and now they're both dissecting two completely different, quote-unquote, problems. So that's really, that's what I was gunning for.
Well, that's like a lot of CMV posts usually start off with the OP sort of defining what they mean by words, because people sort of have very different interpretations of what things are and are not.
The name of my book that I chose was A Brief History of Liberty, and it's by David Schmitz and Jason Brennan. I kind of wish, I mean, now that I've read you guys, or heard what you guys were picking, I really wanted to pick either The Law of Superheroes or The Armchair Economist, because they take the law and the economy, or I should say economics, and like put them down into little real life applications or real life stories to demonstrate the principles on a more micro level, so that people can, you know, get a grasp of them using ideas they're familiar with. And now I'm wondering if maybe I should have gone with those. Plus, Ryan Davidson, who writes The Law of Superheroes, actually posts on Reddit. Like, I see him all the time in our law.
I'm writing this down because that sounds kind of cool.
Oh, wow.
But is it like Superman doing trolley problems? Is that the deal?
Yeah, like The Law of Superheroes, basically, it'll take... He has a blog, and like one of the blog posts he did was like, is the contract in The Hobbit an enforceable contract?
That's fantastic.
So sort of taking the problems that pop up in comics and dissects them as though they were an actual case to be litigated.
Wow.
A fun fact about the contract thing, if you actually start looking at the prop they used in The Hobbit, they actually bothered to actually write out a full contract like it was in the book.
Is that for real?
Yeah, they didn't write gibberish, they wrote out a full contract.
Now, is it like copy paste from the DMV?
It's senseless dedication that no one but the prop makers care about, but they cared about it.
They really did. Well, you know what's funny is that I have a side project going right now where I'm trying to organize the deities of the Marvel Universe, and I actually just picked up my first comic book I bought in about 20 years. But it's the same thing. It's like applying the rules of logic to like who's more powerful than who and why, because it changes, you know. So you're trying to make sense of something that's not necessarily a coherent paradigm, like the law thing, but at the same time, it's super fun to play with. Yeah. Well, of your official book, Pepperoni, is there anything that you think maybe would be worth bringing up just to kind of as a core thing so we don't miss the thrust of it?
Oh gosh, I'm trying to remember the last time I actually read this was in college, and I'm pretty old. I guess no, not really. Is it like not more than what I outlined? Was just generally if you like. I don't want people to get lost in the fact that it has the word liberty in the title. Like, if you like philosophy, if you like trying to take these broader ideas and whittle them down, and basically perform that exercise, I think there might actually be questions at the end of each chapter. It's a good read and a good thought experiment, I suppose.
Gotcha. So it engages you as you progress through the book in a way that helps you remember it and all that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just, like I said, it's super clear. A lot of the books that I pick because I like the writing, because I don't consider myself an especially good writer. I tend towards run-on sentences, just to spill my thoughts out as soon as possible. And a lot of these chapters
we haven't
are
at all discussed
very crisp.
Blackheart's book.
Yeah. Well, I think this might be a good time to switch over there then. And
yeah, I had How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie, which is a really good old classic sort of breakdown of ways to sort of get people to side with you and sort of influence them based on their working with their own desires and making them align with yours. It's a really good resource about sort of figuring out how to appeal yourself to people instead of sort of trying to, you know, like a lot of CMV posts are really aggressive or really trying to, you know, out of the gate start swinging, and that's not really the best way to sort of side with somebody and influence them. So it's a really nice way of sort of being friendly and approaching things and slowly easing people to your side.
Yeah, I haven't read this book, but I think there's something to be said for either humanizing yourself or humanizing the issue, because it makes it, you know, if you talk about something in such an abstract way and at an arm's length, it's a lot easier to pick at low-hanging fruit or maybe come at it more aggressively or unkind. And I know that in our CMV rules, it's not really a rule, but it's sort of an unwritten norm that you want to assume good faith on behalf of the person who is presenting their view or who you're talking with, because it just makes them overall more receptive to what you have to say, as opposed to just coming out at them like with an attack.
Yeah. I have a few, like as I was reading, I sort of took cliff notes almost, just as something to reference whenever I'm going into like writing an application letter or I'm trying to really convince somebody or anything. Some of the ideas that he's talking that are sort of discussed in the book is to discuss things in terms of the other person's interests first, sort of try to get them to talk about themselves and become happy and open, try to make connections with them, be respectful, of course, trying to get people to say yes and yes and yes before you start disagreeing with them, to try to get them in a more open-minded mood, and try to talk about things and slowly like ask questions so it feels to them like they came up with the idea, which I think is a really powerful tool. I try to make it seem like they came up with something and add that revelation on their own, because if people take ownership of changing their own mind, it's going to be a lot more powerful than somebody trying to force it on them. And yeah, there's a lot of different techniques as sort of using people's own self-interests against them in a way to try to align your interests with theirs and motivate them.
It's so funny because this is actually a book that I have read, and I remember reading it and being like, wow, this is really cool. This is a smart sort of way to connect with people. And it's really funny to hear you put it in terms of aligning with people's self-interest, because it sounds like such a pragmatic way of looking at it.
Well, yeah, it sounds a little bit,
you know what I mean?
Cynical almost, kind of.
Yeah.
It's sort of like the idea of taking advantage of somebody, but it's really not. It's that we've all got our own wants and desires and needs, and when in every interaction we both want to get value, each of us in the interaction want to get value out of it. So it's finding ways to empathize with people, finding ways to find common ground with people, and then sort of shift their views to where you want them to be by showing them how this is also what they would want. This is beneficial to them as well.
It's really interesting because I know when we talk about your view and my view, it sounds like there's an ownership over it. But I mean, when we get right down to it, there isn't any ownership over it. So it's easy to think it sounds cynical to put it in their own self-interest. But really what you're doing is, if people are connecting dots, sometimes they think there are only 3 dots to connect, but they're making a series of assumptions that they don't realize. And by getting them to verbalize their view and get to the revelation themselves, they start to see that they might be making those assumptions and they might not agree with those assumptions. And that lets them start picking away or being a little more critical of their original position and listen to what you have to say, I would contend.
Yeah. And that's what your book was talking about, and I think Nehaj's book was talking about as well, is the idea of that people have like their own definitions of things. So what you really need to do is to associate with people and understand what their definition is, and then work within that framework.
And so one might say these techniques are tenuous or manipulative, but on the other hand, it's literally what works on humans, and it presumes a baseline of subtext no is there anyway.
Well, I mean, the whole point of it is sort of techniques for being empathetic, really. It's the idea of being respectful, being understanding, and then using that understanding as a common ground to then move forward with, motivating people.
Right on, cool. Well, that gets us through 3 out of our 4 books. So I think we have just to chip in more on that. Sorry, I might have gotten a little ahead of you there, but
yeah.
We're missing Kyle's, right?
Right, yeah. So my book was Jonathan Livingston Seagull by Richard Bach. I'm just going to give a brief synopsis of the book. So Jonathan Livingston Seagull is about basically a seagull that doesn't want to follow what his flock does. He wants to fly in a different way that they've ever flown. He wants to fly like a falcon and learn to do like all sorts of diving tricks and such. And he's sort of shunned from the group for doing that. And ultimately, he fails a bunch of times, and then he gets really, really good at flying beyond his nature, what he's supposed to be as a seagull, and transcends and starts to gain followers and so on and so forth. So I don't know, it's really a good book about following what your nature is, regardless of what you maybe told your place in society is. But I think it is a simple message, just one that's perhaps difficult to put into practice.
Right. I mean, so I haven't read this. I feel like I should, especially if it's only, you said 40 pages. But I'll just circle back to what I said when Mihach was experiencing technical difficulties, which is that it reminds me of a hidden brain podcast called How to Build a Better Job, and they fiddle with the term job crafting, which is basically they surveyed a bunch of people like hospital janitors, and there's a job description, but they were able to kind of craft their own boundaries of what their job actually entails, and therefore found a much more fulfilling career and profession than their counterparts who just did what they were told their job was. And obviously, like, there are certain risks and liabilities. Like, you can't have a janitor be a doctor. But they definitely found more ways to incorporate, like, speaking with the patients and patient outreach. And they found a lot more fulfillment in their work that way. And just reminded me of what you said with respect to not necessarily following the flock, to stay in your place and maybe like push a little differently than you were told to do originally.
Yeah.
So in everything that you're doing, you're just sort of, making sure that you're working on your own strengths.
Yeah. It has a lot of the spirit of like entrepreneurialism in it as well, where we have established ways of doing things. And anything new is seen as novel until it's successful.
I have to at least bring up slightly is like, what do you do to believe in themselves but is totally misguided? Like some of our OPs from time to time.
There's a level of self-awareness involved in everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair point. Like, if it was going to harm the seagull, like if he was going to get hurt in his endeavor, or just to circle back to the only thing I'm familiar with because I haven't read this book is if any of the janitors had begun like taking part in like the physical therapy of the patients, but they don't know what they're doing, like that would be bad no matter how much they want it to be who they are. But I think it's like a broad message and a broad takeaway. There's a lot telling people today, like what's regimented and what's required and what the basic requirements are. I would contend there's like a lot less harm in maybe softening that and saying, well, like, yes, there's a reasonable delineation between like what you should do and like what you're not qualified to do, but within the scope of things that are basically harmless and more scary, like if it's scary but it seems right to you and it won't harm you or other people on the whole, maybe you should just go for it.
It's just a healthy dose of skepticism and everything.
Yeah, I think there's definitely self-awareness in general is a virtuous thing to have.
Any other insights on that one you guys want to chip in? Okay, cool.
Take that as a no.
So we've had a nice, I think, discussion back and forth with everyone here, but would you guys want to go into more of that?
I have an idea.
Go for it.
Can we just do a live CMV?
Oh.
Let's just air some stuff out. Let's put an idea out there.
I mean, I'll be completely honest, I don't have a super strong opinion about telling kids about Santa Claus.
Yeah.
Oh,
I
man.
mean, not strongly either way, really.
I mean, it's sort of like, I understand the issue with, number one, lying to kids. Number two, that overarching sense that someone is watching you, they're getting comfortable with that. Number three, it's sort of a, frankly, what is the PG word for what I want to say? It's a crappy way of getting your kids, of incentivizing your kids to get into good behaviors. But at the same time, like, I remember growing up and there was a lot more emphasis on the fun part of Santa Claus, like going to visit Santa Claus and writing letters to Santa Claus. And it's one of the few areas in my life where I remember actively imagining something and being convinced enough that it almost felt real. Whereas deep down with the Easter Bunny, I never really felt that way. And with a lot of the fictional books I read, you know, when I was reading the book, I could get into it. But once I closed the covers, it was over. But that's also the product of having like a really benevolent family life. I don't know if that validates the concept on the whole.
Well, I think to an extent, especially with children, it's good to encourage imagination and things. And I don't really see, I get the idea of lying to a kid, but letting them watch Looney Tunes or anything, is that not the same sort of thing where they're just sort of going along and playing along with these characters? And they might even be convinced that these are real characters, but they aren't. And I think a part of growing up is having those imaginary friends, having those characters, and then learning to kind of grow up and understand the difference between fantasy and reality.
Yeah, I largely agree with you. I mean, I'm almost trying to pick at my own basic leaning towards saying Santa's fine by, is it really? But you're right. I mean, with kids, first of all, like, even if you're not lying to them, they often believe things that aren't true. And again, if it's not harmful, why not let them indulge a little bit the way you do with other fiction? And you're right, at the same time, like, it's a coming of age experience to find out that's not real and distinguish between things that are and are not.
Well, I think one thing here that makes it, and I'm thinking of probably myself 6 years ago when I first really kind of figured out I probably was atheist and got really Dawkins and Hitchens and all the, this new atheist thing and logic and getting deeper into that philosophy and zealot like a convert, right? So if you asked me then, I'd be like, no, you got to teach kids critical thinking, don't lie to them, and you don't want to teach all these potentially corrupting, not ideas, but process issues of ideas, like how we process ideas, and still have a little bit of fun with Santa at a young enough age that you can, from what I was talking to my brother about this, and he's like, on some level, the kids kind of tell you the level of Santa they want. I wonder even if on some level there's an evolutionary adapted thing here with kids in play and the initiation of you get to find out it's fake, and if maybe there is an adaptive thing there that's in our history. And I'm kind of okay with it now, roll in the leaves a little bit, have fun, but don't take it too seriously past long. But yeah,
well, that was kind of what I was thinking in terms of like it's okay to the point where it becomes damaging, but at what point is it no longer okay? At what point do you draw the line and say it is you're too old to be believing in Santa Claus and it is stunting your growth? Where is that line?
That's a hard line to draw.
By case parent call, like some kids are ready earlier than others,
Yeah.
I mean it's certainly on a case by case.
Like on the bus.
Yeah. As soon as you're old to ride a bus, you're too old to be believing in Santa Claus.
I see the parallel that's commonly drawn in what Mihaj said between like God and, or really, I guess like any kind of, not just God, but gods, religion, and Santa Claus. And I think I'd push back on that just a little bit in the sense, I mean, number one, you have a lot of really great historical thinkers that possessed critical thinking skills and were like fervently religious. And number two, like I was raised Catholic, but I'm not religious and I don't believe in God. So now I'm in trouble if my parents hear this podcast. But I would say if anything had a lasting impact on me, it was a lot more of the stuff. It was the actual religious stuff. It was the kind of religious penalties you could suffer for not doing like good works versus like, was there ever a year I got coal? No. So I wasn't actually worried about Santa Claus smiting me in any meaningful way. But again, like, is that because...
Yeah, I didn't have existential echoes of a health threat.
Right, like, but again, like, just to poke into my own theory, I guess, is that a mark in my parents' column as being good parents, or is it a mark in, like, the Santa Claus myth? Because I could see, like, what if you wanted to be a jerk to your kid? Like, what if you were a mean parent, or a very strict parent who would give coal just to keep the narrative alive because you feel like it's really important for your kid to learn there's consequences for his actions? I don't know if there are parents who were doing that, but yeah, I mean, it might be a bit of a ham-fisted example, but at the end of the day, if you're talking about, like, an incentive and a consequence, I mean, I guess you could see parents out there who would use Santa Claus as a threat and, like, make good in that threat somehow.
Well, that's where the Elf on the Shelf comes in.
No, Elf on the Shelf, I think is super creepy because it takes that you like. Okay, Mihaj, you were saying the kid lets you know how much Santa they want, right? But Elf on the Shelf doesn't. It just turns it into a physical form that's supposed to be watching you. And again, I'm not a parent. I don't have kids, and I'm not entirely familiar with how the incentive system works in Elf on the Shelf. But I think there is like a literal like incremental incentive to behave a certain way each night. Kind of like an advent calendar for kids, where each day something happens.
I think the problem with that is it takes it from being sort of a metaphysical idea to being a very physical presence. Sort of instead of, oh, he's watching you when you sleep and when you're awake, and he'll make sure. No, it's there. It's right watching there. You.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I have nothing else to
I
add.
mean,
Some of those.
I have to say, I feel like I didn't grow up with Elf on the Shelf, so I'm not
Yeah.
entirely familiar with it. But I feel like honestly, I feel like we're overanalyzing something that is ultimately benign. I mean, like, it's kind of creepy when people play with dolls, for example. It's benign, but like they're playing with humans and they're making them do things. And the Elf on the Shelf is, I think, just meant to be a cute symbol that you put somewhere and say, "Oh, look, he's watching you. You better be good." And it's more tongue in cheek than we're giving it credit for.
Well, I think the difference between a doll and an elf on the shelf sort of thing is that with kids playing with their toys, it's their imagination imprinting on the toys. It's their own world. They have control. And the elf is just there. It's like a security camera.
That's fair. That's fair.
So so I guess we need a survey of 100 kids on how seriously they take it.
If the kids enjoy it, and it turns out like 30 years from now, you do a survey of them as adults, and they're not huge, like, oh yeah, like Elf on the Shelf really messed me up, then who cares, right?
Yeah.
But just standing here now and watching it happen, I mean, it makes me feel old. Like I'm one of the. Oh, back in my day, we didn't do that, and that's super weird and creepy. But it could be as Kyle said, and just be like much ado about nothing.
Nostalgia.
I'm actually trying to I don't think we ever said what Elf on the Shelf is. There's actually on the webpage, it's www.elfontheshelf.com, and they have an about page, and it sounds like the kid helps Santa complete all of his Christmas duties, but it doesn't go into much more detail than that I can
Okay, you've just made it sound like child labor.
Yeah, I think maybe this is to be determined, because it's all I know is like my cousin has a kid and she had Elf on the Shelf, and it sounded kind of like the kid has to help, but if they don't help, like, beware.
So it's teaching
disturbing.
industriousness.
That's one way to put it.
I've said what I want to on the Santa thing. Anyone else have any other thoughts to add in?
No. Sorry.
Not really. I mean, it's sort of, I guess, as far as, and I think I mentioned this on the last one we did on televangelism, the idea of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, the idea that, the communal and meditative aspects of faith can be really useful, and the idea of Santa being something where, a kid, when I was a kid, I would, like, I guess 3 to 5, I'd sit up at night before going to sleep and sort of talk to Santa as a meditative, getting out things that I wanted to say. So the idea of having sort of a presence that you can speak to in more sort of as a way to sort of reflect on yourself, I think is a good idea. That doesn't necessarily have to be a faith or a genuine belief, but the idea of a sort of self-reflection is good.
I tried to capture Santa, so I think you and I have like extremely different approaches to this.
I remember like looking under the tree and seeing presents like with the little tag that said "From Santa" in my dad's handwriting. So I figured out pretty quickly. I was like, wait, why does Santa's handwriting look like my dad's? Oh wait, it is my dad.
I'm just imagining like Macaulay Culkin now waiting for Santa.
My dad masked his handwriting, but one memory I have is I'm actually the oldest of 3, so I got to help out with that stuff when I was old enough to know, but my siblings weren't. And I can remember being on the bus and back to the bus, and I was with my sister, and they started talking about how Santa wasn't real, and I was like, you'd better not, like, not now.
It's too soon.
Totally like hazing ritual, like you're in or you're not in yet.
Mm-hmm.
There are archetypal things that kick in around that, like as a human being. That I knew and my little brother didn't. Prepared for that moment already in me. It feels ancient.
You're one of the cool kids now.
Yeah. I thought we'd just tie this back to the core here on Change My View and see that's relating to this, the holidays, and.
Well, I think especially with the books we were talking about, it's a lot of. I think people need to go to the CMV wiki and look a little bit at the tactics that we have provided in the wiki, and maybe pick up the books as well, because there's a lot of understanding how to sort of make sense of people's views, why they're coming from, where they're coming from, and apply that to influencing people.
Yeah, I feel like there are a lot of norms, stuff that we can't police or put into writing and make people do, but stuff that makes the CMV community successful. Like that good faith assumption, for example. Like, we don't make anybody come in and assume good faith on OPs. And sometimes they don't deserve it. Some people are there and they're just evangelizing, and we have to come down hard on that. But for the most part, the reason why CMV works is because we assume everyone is there with the goal of having their view changed unless they demonstrate otherwise. And a lot of our books, I think Blackheart's in particular, they were hammering home those norms.
Oh man, how do we summarize? You know what I found interesting about this conversation is we sort of, I think on just about everybody's book, kind of agreed on a message, but also a middle ground, or at least some sort of temperament of the message. That some sort of, most of the time the message is not good in its absolute form, but we have to take it in context. So, for example, Mihatch, like with your book, putting feelings over facts is a bad thing, but giving entertainment as a way to convey information is not a bad thing. So there's a middle ground to be had there. And I think that's important to keep in mind when in Change My View, because a lot of people come in with absolute ideas. This is that, and that's what I believe. And even just showing them a way to temper that from an absolute can be a very, very positive thing.
Yeah, I am a very firm believer in skepticism and moral ambiguity, So
Gotcha.
That's what I preach.
All right. Well, as years go and our ordinary lives happen, the holiday time is really that one weird time of the year where everything just shuts down and you have a little space to breathe. And it is a time as the new year starts, things refresh, renew. And so what better a time of year to take a deep, maybe our own opinions and have our views changed. Both you hosts and our listeners out there. Tis to come in to Change My View and, post something up, have a discussion.
Okay.
Yeah, I would really encourage
all I got.
everybody to take advantage of the time off from the holidays. I actually have two conflicting messages, which is like, I feel like I'm being pulled in two different directions. And the first is I kind of want to unplug because I've been so plugged in due to the election. But at the same time, this is one of the few times of year where everyone can sit down and pay attention to the things they want to pay attention to. So if you feel like you haven't had a chance to sit down and CMV lately, it might be the time to post your view or see what's out there. We're definitely getting a lot of the same topics, so anything to shake things up would be, I think, great.
If you're going to post your view, post sort of part of your OP is, what you're less certain of, so people have a starting point to sort of pick away at your view. Because a lot of OPs come in with these really definite definitions, but don't really explain what they're doubting about, what they aren't certain about.
The Change My View community is a unique place with a lot of interesting opinions, but a certain filter of who ends up being there. The kind of people who have those open minds, but also the kind of people who could truly and thoughtfully recommend a good book. So give us your thoughts on Twitter. Our Twitter handle, the CMV Podcast. We'd love to hear from you. Have a great holiday season. Good night.